On the changing nature of the threat from the Islamic State group and how to counter it. For that, we turn to 4 people with deep expertise. Juliette Kayyem was an assistant secretary at the Department of Homeland Security during the Obama administration. She now has her own security consulting firm. William McCants is director of the Project on U.S. Relations with the Islamic World at the Brookings Institution. His most recent book is The ISIS Apocalypse: The History, Strategy, and Doomsday Vision of the Islamic State. Richard Barrett is a former director of global counterterrorism operations for the British government. He's a founder of the United Nations Counterterrorism Task Force. And Hassan is a Middle East analyst at Chatham House in London. He co-authored the book, ISIS, Inside the Army of Terror, and we welcome you all to the program. Will McCants, I'm going to start here in Washington with you. What have we learned from the Islamic State group from these attacks? What new do we know about them now?
Well, they seem to have shifted and taken on a strategy of global jihad. They've always had the rhetoric of global jihadism, similar to al-Qaeda. They've always talked about hitting the far enemy, the United States, France, and others. But for most of their history, they've focused on state building, and for the past few years, they've been pretty successful at it. But with the attacks over the past 2 weeks, taking down the Russian airliner, the attack in Beirut, and now in Paris, we believe that its attention has shifted abroad.
Richard Barrett, if this is so, that their attention has shifted abroad, how was it missed? How did this happen?
I think the European and other Western intelligence agencies have been looking out for this to happen for some time. They've not been oblivious to the threat, and we understand that about 7 previous plots have been thwarted in France and another 7 in the United Kingdom. And indeed in Belgium, it wasn't so very long ago that the mastermind of this attack, so-called, narrowly escaped a police raid on the safe house that he was living in with his accomplices there. So it's not as though this has suddenly come out of the blue. And the problem, I think, is that there are so many people of concern to the security services that it's really difficult for them to focus their resources. Hindsight is great. You know, now everybody knows that all these people were known beforehand. But foresight is very, very difficult because there's just so many people who could be one of the guys who attacked in Paris last Friday.
Juliette Kayyem, how much has the West, the United States, and the rest of NATO underestimated ISIS?
I don't think they've entirely underestimated it. I think it is just a difficult threat to confront. There's both the geographic aspect of ISIS, that they just cover a lot of land in the Middle East, and then the sort of, terrorist incidents, whether it's the lone wolf, the individual who's getting radicalized, or the much more sophisticated attacks like what we saw in Paris. And so there's just different pieces to minimizing and degrading the threat of ISIS, and none of them is going to work perfectly. And all they need to do is succeed once. And that has been people have been waiting for this. I know that sounds sort of harsh and not sympathetic, but this was not a shock. They have been saying they wanted to do this. I think the shock is that none of the pieces were picked up beforehand, seemingly by any intelligence agencies.
Hassan, what is the appeal? We heard Juliette Kayyem talk just now about lone wolves, and we know that there are lone wolves, and we've seen that act out. But this was a lot of people, and we now are hearing that there's like a 24-hour help desk with ISIS. What is changing? How is it evolving?
Well, in terms of appeal, ISIS appeals because of because it has the caliphate building enterprise that is actually functioning, or it looks like functioning, at least for people who are potential sympathizers to the group. But ISIS has always had this twin strategy that actually feeds into each other. The 2 facets of the strategy. The first one is the one I mentioned, the caliphate building enterprise that feeds into its global ideological appeal and makes people outside look at the group as something different, something that might have been that they have been thinking about for a while. The appeal of the caliphate, the appeal of a powerful Muslim state that's opposed to Western hegemony in the Middle East. And at the same time, ISIS looks now like it has started to focus on its global network. But I think the fact is what we've seen recently with the Russian airliner, with the attacks in Paris, is only a sign that ISIS's global network has developed. It's now more capable, more mature in its ability to strike abroad, and I think that's only a sign of that's happening. Otherwise, ISIS has had that in mind for a while. I remember last year I sat with someone in Turkey, in southern Turkey, who works with ISIS as a security official, someone who sets up sleeper cells, who spies and so on. And he told me something that we've learned from the Iraq War is that instead of waiting for other people to spy on us or to infiltrate us and attack us or preempt a war against us, we are doing that now. We're establishing eyes and ears in neighboring countries, but also abroad in Western countries and so on.
Well, given that, Will McCants, does this call for the West, for the United States, to change its approach?
I don't think so. The Islamic State has seen 25% of its territory wither under the firepower from the United States and its allies. It's had tens of thousands of its soldiers who have died, and I would argue that this strategy they're pursuing of building cells abroad is a consequence of the success against them. I think where the Americans and others have failed is bringing the Syrian civil war to a close. So the ISIS strategy is right, but the Syrian strategy is not, and that's what's fueling ultimately this conflict.
Yeah. Richard Barrett, one of the questions right after this happened was whether this was al-Qaeda or whether this was ISIS. I don't know if it's a difference without a distinction, or whether ISIS has now eclipsed al-Qaeda as the biggest global threat.
Well, I think it's eclipsed al-Qaeda as the biggest global threat in the number of its supporters, yes. I don't see why some young guy who becomes very radicalized would choose al-Qaeda over Islamic State, because Islamic State is where the action is. It's ISIS that's building the caliphate. It's ISIS that's calling on people to do stuff. It's ISIS which is there, present. It's in the news all the time and so on. So I think that the attraction, if you want to get back at your own society, or if you want to go and join something new, if you feel that you want that sense of adventure and belonging and so on, it's ISIS you're going to choose rather than al-Qaeda. And I think al-Qaeda is also rather difficult to get hold of now, particularly in Afghanistan, Pakistan, but also in Somalia it's rather nationalist. In Yemen maybe, but Yemen is a war zone as well, so it's not so easy. But for ISIS, it's still, I think, relatively easy to join and quite attractive to join.
Juliette Kayyem, what about this question of whether the West should change its approach? The President Obama said today, remember, ISIS is not a state. He said traditional military tactics won't work. That doesn't address who ISIS is. How do you see that?
Well, I hear this all the time, that we have to change our tactics, and I'm not quite sure what people mean. I mean, every tactic is presently being used, and they will be amplified, obviously. After Paris, the Europeans are going to step up to a much greater extent. But this question comes down to, are we willing to commit ground troops, ours and others, into the fight in ISIS? And we just have to speak in English. I mean, we have to say that this is the question. And I just want to remind people who think that we should do that. We had 500,000 troops in Afghanistan and Iraq over the course of 14 years. We still had London.
Juliette Kayyem, we're losing your audio for a second, but we're going to come back to you in just a moment because we want to follow up on that. But Hassan, meanwhile, I want to ask you a little bit about the role that we should expect that international organizations like NATO to play. Or, as we heard today, people saying this is a problem for Muslim nations to solve or to at least take the lead on.
I think this is a really kind of a tricky strategy for fighting ISIS. On one hand, Western countries, especially the United States, are indispensable in the fight against ISIS. No other country can, in the whole world, can mobilize the resources that the United States can. It's capable of getting countries behind it and fighting this war. Now, the problem is when you do that, you risk playing into the hands of ISIS.
Go ahead.
Yeah, you risk basically playing into the hands of ISIS that this is a global war against ISIS, and that appeals to a lot of people who feel when a country or a group is under attack from the West, that means that it has something, it got something right. Now, the question today is whether you step up the current campaign against ISIS, and I think Obama is partly right that the current campaign is effective, and Will McCants just mentioned, is effective in a measured way, in the sense that it's containing ISIS militarily, in the sense that it's preventing it from going to Baghdad, to Erbil, to countries, in neighboring countries. But that won't defeat ISIS. The other option that needs to be in the place, on the table, is not to drop more bombs and strike more against ISIS inside Raqqa, but to really to start a very heavy-handed, if you like, political process that really resolve the conflict in Syria and Iraq, rather than allow the conflict to fester and grow, and protract.
Well, let me ask Will McCants to respond to that, and then, if you will, comment on how vulnerable you think the U.S. is.
I think the current campaign is working. But the challenge is that there are many more places in the Middle East and North Africa for ISIS to go. Because of the political instability, there are many security vacuums opening up, and ISIS is seeking to continue its state building in those countries.
You don't mean to attack, you mean to go and gather recruits.
Go and gather recruits, but also to build states in Libya and in Yemen and also in Somalia. So even if we deal with the ISIS problem in Syria and Iraq, it's still metastasizing and growing.
Well, let me follow up with Juliette Kayyem, if we have her microphone back, to ask that question, because of course you were at the Department of Homeland Security, so you have a unique point of view about how vulnerable Americans should be feeling in all of this.
Well, look, America was built vulnerable, and we have to accept that. And so as government officials, we think about it not reducing risk to zero, but how do you reduce risk and then fortify targets that might be attractive to terrorists? But just given our country and the flow of people and goods and ideas and the kind of commercial activity we have, we're never going to get it to zero. And so that's why you have different pieces of the Homeland Security network, which also includes, of course, the private sector and individuals engaging. But this idea of, or the question, are we safe? I mean, I sort of feel like always answering, of course not. I mean, we live in a vulnerable society, and we choose to make us as safe or perfectly safe would require, say, bag checks on subways. Well, New York City would shut down if that were the case. So we're just balancing these different risks at various stages.
Well, we appreciate that, Juliette Kayyem. Apologies about the microphone difficulty, but we were able to understand what you were saying. Thank you.
Thank you.
We thank you, Richard Barrett, Hassan, and here in Washington, Will McCants. We appreciate it.